The year was 1991. Terminator 2 was a highest-grossing movie. Sonic the Hedgehog made his debut, and in December of that year, Todd McFarlane, Jim Lee, and Rob Liefeld met with the Marvel Comics president at the time, Terry Stewart, and editor Tom DeFalco. The artists had been growing frustrated in the years prior, having been the main selling point for some of Marvel's biggest titles such as Spider-Man and the X-Men, but not receiving much in the way of rewards for the contributions, despite their designs going on to inspire multiple media properties, and continually facing a lack of creative control. Along with the backing of other creators, Erik Larsen, Marc Silvestri, Jim Valentino, and Whilce Portacio, they made it clear on that day that there weren't going to be negotiations. They had no demands. They wanted out. In that one meeting, Marvel Comics lost 7 of its biggest creators, and they weren't jumping ship to DC either. When the news became public, Marvel shares plummeted, and it can be argued that this was the catalyst for the tumultuous decade that followed. But that's not the point of this video, mostly because I don't understand the stock market. Instead, we're looking at the career of those 7 pioneers who went on to create the independent juggernaut known as Image Comics.
Woof woof!
Hey guys, it's me Marcus aka the Mad Dog, and I wanted to dedicate a video to the 7 Image Comics founders. This is something that I was aiming to do for the 30th anniversary for the company, but in case you didn't already know, I am quite lazy. And sure, yeah, the story of how these 7 creators came together to form Image is well documented, but where did they go after that? Even today, Image Comics still stands tall with big names like Robert Kirkman, Jonathan Hickman, Ed Brubaker, and Rick Remender still bringing out great titles over 30 years after Image was launched. But for a company that was founded on 2 core principles, one being that the creators own the work and not the company, and secondly that none of the Image partners could interfere whether creatively or financially in another partner's work, the 7 founding members went along various different paths in the 3 decades since they created one of the biggest comic publishers. Some went on to rejoin with the companies that they aspired to get away from in the first place, others stuck with what they'd built and formed their own publishing imprints, and one of them faced a life-threatening condition that almost took them out of the industry completely. But one by one, let's take a look at each individual founder and see exactly where they went after they changed the comics landscape. Jim Lee. Born in Seoul, South Korea in 1964, Jim Lee made a name for himself on titles such as Alpha Flight and Punisher War Journal. His sharp lines and dynamic action helped him stand at the forefront of the artistic movement that would eventually become Image Comics, and was the reason why he'd land the penciling duties of what would become the highest selling single issue of all time in X-Men issue 1, a style that would later be used in X-Men the Animated Series. Having been recruited by Todd in 1991, Lee was enticed by the idea of having more creative control that presented itself in the form of Image Comics, and Lee was there at the forefront alongside McFarlane and Liefeld, hitting the ground running with Wildcats, Deathblow and Gen 13, along with having his own imprint that would later become Wildstorm Productions. I'd have called it Studio Jim Lee. However, it was only a few years after Image was created that Lee and Liefeld went back to Marvel to work on a relaunch of some of the company's biggest titles. Lee started on Iron Man and Fantastic Four, with his studio later picking up the other 2 books once Liefeld was removed. And don't worry, we're gonna get to that later. Despite maintaining Wildstorm and having it publish fan and critically acclaimed titles such as The Authority, Planetary, and teaming up with Alan Moore, the pressures of being a publisher weighed heavy on Lee, and he wasn't aware when signing up for Image that it would drastically diminish his ability to focus on art. This led to him selling Wildstorm to DC Comics in 1998, but trying to find out exactly how much they bought it for is harder than me trying to find the will to live. But whilst doing art at DC, he did a generation-defining stint on Batman Hush, was the best part about Superman for Tomorrow, and was on the flagship book during DC's company-wide New 52 relaunch. Which, yep, of course, is my jam. We've even got merchandise to prove it. Link in the description. He also held a number of positions within the company, ascending the ranks behind the scenes and steadily moving away from doing regular art, which might have been for the best as he struggled to maintain the schedule of a regular series. This culminated with Jim Lee being announced as the president of DC Comics in May of 2023, which is almost like his reason for selling Wildstorm Comics 25 years earlier has come full circle. So after starting Image, he ended up becoming even more integral to comics overall, setting himself up for life with an estimated net worth of anywhere between $10 million and somehow $73 million, and have somehow not found any kind of middle ground. He got married to his wife in 2009 and has 9 kids with her in total, along with some really motivated sperm it seems. Like damn, 9? That's impressive. The Justice League rarely needs that many people. Either way, he's done himself proud, and if you wanted to learn more about Jim Lee through just 5 of his works, then check out this video here. Jim Valentino. Born in 1952 in the Bronx, Valentino was the Image founder who'd spent the longest in the industry, having spent the majority of the early 80s publishing independent titles and backup features such as Normal Man. This led to him working for Marvel, with his first work being as a writer for a handful of issues on the Silver Surfer, Savage Sword of Conan, and What If. We got the chance to pick the pencils back up alongside the writing duties for his run on Guardians of the Galaxy that started in 1990, and was the last work that he'd do for the publisher prior to Image launching. He had plans for the series to go as far as 50 issues, but was fired from the title after Image was announced. Despite Valentino asking editor Craig Anderson if he could reduce his duties to just writing, he decided to join the initiative as soon as Rob spoke to him about it, but was harshly labelled in the comic community as the weakest link of the 7 when it was officially announced. It's something Jim hasn't shied away from in the past, and it's mostly because he was primarily seen as a writer, and the other 6 creators had worked on bigger selling titles. To compensate for this, he brought his knowledge from having spent most of his formative comic years at independent publishers, and stuck to the idea that Image Comics was supposed to be the antithesis of what Marvel represented. His first title for the publisher was Shadowhawk, which he both wrote and illustrated, and also named his own imprint Shadowline after, along with doing the work on a second title that was a semi-autobiographical black and white series. And despite it not being as big of a seller as some of the other Image titles, it helped the publisher to step out of the umbrella of just being another superhero company. And despite being fired by them only 4 years earlier, Valentino returned to Marvel alongside some of his fellow Image founders to script the first few issues of the Avengers Heroes Reborn series. But he knew that his heart was always with Image. His contributions to the company were taken to the next level in 1999 when he stepped into the role of publisher and expanded the number of genres that Image tackled. Here he discovered huge names in Brian Michael Bendis and Robert Kirkman. However, behind the scenes, this is where the teething problems really started to rear their head, as Marc Silvestri left the company and took Top Cow with him, along with Jim Lee selling Wildstorm to DC, leading to a drop in sales for Image Comics that was only worsened by an overall decline in comic book interest. But it also could have gone much worse, as after the initial intrigue towards Image had left, Valentino helped steer the company into remaining the 3rd biggest publisher after Marvel and DC. However, this only lasted until 2003, when Erik Larsen replaced him as publisher, leading to Jim revitalising his Shadowline imprint and continuing on with the series that he'd started at Image. Honestly, there's not a lot online about his personal life. His net worth is estimated to be around $2 million, but this is from a website that pretty much has no other information about him. It even refers to him as Vladimir at one point, so I guess it just kind of speaks to how poor I am at researching. Todd McFarlane. Arguably the face of Image Comics, McFarlane was born in Alberta, Canada in 1961 and rose to superstardom in the comics industry thanks to his contributions on Spider-Man, and in particular with the creation of Venom. But before that, had worked on Batman Year 2 and created designs that were so vivid and distinct that they still stick in fans' minds decades later. However, after threatening to leave because of how dissatisfied he was with the amount of control that he had over his work, Marvel launched a new Spider-Man title that Todd could both write and draw, with the first issue selling an estimated 2.5 million copies. But this was also during the height of the variant cover craze. But tensions continued to build as Marvel felt that the title was too dark, and even edited certain graphic panels, which led to McFarlane teaming up with Liefeld and the other Image founders. When I said Todd is arguably the face of Image Comics, that's more so because of his debut title with the company, Spawn. The second book to be released at Image quickly became its biggest success, with the debut issue selling 1.7 million copies, and holding the title for the best-selling independent comic ever released. He created his own imprint titled Todd McFarlane Productions Incorporated. I wonder where he got the inspiration for that name. And even had huge names jumping in on Spawn, such as Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman and Frank Miller. Spawn was the mascot for Image Comics and arguably still is to this day. But if you don't know who he is, then make sure you check out this video. And his success opened the door for a crossover with Batman, and is one of the only starting Image titles that is still being published today, along with being the longest running creator-owned series in comics history. It's weathered quite a few periods of low popularity over the years, but when announcing 4 spin-off titles in 2021, you'd never believe he ever fell out of Diamond's top 100. In 1993, Todd debated Peter David on the criticism that Image had faced. In 1997, Spawn got a movie adaptation that drove even more attention to the franchise. This was created in collaboration with another company that Todd owned called McFarlane Entertainment, which also produced an acclaimed Spawn animated series and a handful of music videos. He also founded Todd's Toys, which started off by just producing Spawn figures, and hilariously had to change the name to McFarlane Toys toys after Mattel got annoyed because they had a Barbie character that was called Todd. But this didn't stop production of figures, and different IPs were picked up, and even DC ended up using them for their lines. Todd also was influential in the collected edition scene for Image, with Spawn having pretty much every format available in a comprehensive edition. Some of these even recently got reprinted, making the series even more accessible than ever before, and if you want to pick any of these up, you can get them with the discount codes that we've got with the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Beyond Spawn, McFarlane teamed back up with the other company founders when he helped out with the art for Image United in 2009 and did the inks and some of the covers for Robert Kirkman's Haunt. He had a few tough lawsuits in the 2000s, like when he went up against Neil Gaiman over the rights for a character named Angela, losing a $5 million case against a hockey player for basing a mobster in Spawn on him, but this pales in comparison to his reported net worth of over $300 million, which is just a mental number to think about, and I have no idea what the sources are on these websites. He married his wife Wanda in 1985, and they have 3 children together. To this day, Todd is still very active within the comics industry and is the current president of Image Comics, having never gone back to work for Marvel after his initial departure, and it's safe to say that that gamble that he made over 30 years ago really paid off. Erik Larsen. Born in Minnesota in 1962, Larsen had a rocky start to his comic career. He first did some work in a fanzine he created with some friends called Graphic Fantasy, which featured an early rendition of the Savage Dragon character that Larsen would become famous for. This got him some penciling work over at DC on titles such as Adventures of Superman, Teen Titans, and Doom Patrol, but his style was so different from what was expected on those books that he received backlash, and his initial time at Marvel wasn't smooth either. The odd fill-in issue here, or a brief stint on a story arc there, Larsen struggled to gain traction despite having a hyper-detailed, physically impossible style that carried so much expression in its action. He had an idea for a Nova story who was one of the characters that he really gravitated towards, but he got sidelined because he was in the team book The New Warriors. And instead, Erik ended up doing an Excalibur story, which, despite not caring much for the team, something that I take personally as a Brit, led to him getting picked up to replace McFarlane on The Amazing Spider-Man. Much like his fellow Image founder, this was the launchpad for his success, and where his art finally got the appreciation and recognition he'd been working for, and added iconic elements to Venom such as that big ass tongue that he's always got. The omnibus of Larsen's time with the Wallcrawler is also getting a reprint next year, which if you're in the EU and you wanted to pre-order it or grab any other books and you wanted free shipping and free gifts with every order, then the only place that you need to go is Comics Bugle. They're easily the best for anybody living in the EU, and they've been a pleasure to work with, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale, so make sure you're getting your orders in. However, he left Marvel with the other Image founders because he was seeking greater creative control over his work, and launched a revamped version of his Savage Dragon character, a muscular, green-skinned, thin, superhuman police officer that was eventually listed in Wizard Magazine's greatest comic book characters. Sure, yeah, it was at number 116, but that's still higher than any character that I've ever created. Savage Dragon has been a staple of Image Comics since its debut in 1992, and is one of the only launch titles aside from Spawn that is still being printed today. Larsen still writes and illustrates a series, and oversaw an animated show that was created around the character that aired in 1995. As well as this, he worked on the 1998 relaunch of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, wrote a few issues of Aquaman in the same year, went back to Marvel where he got a chance to finally do the Nova series that he wanted, and added a cheeky Savage Dragon reference in it, which will be a surprise to nobody that watched my Marvel Iceberg video, and has worked on many other Image titles including Spawn, Image United, and Supreme. In 2004, Larsen stepped into the role of publisher for Image Comics, but stepped down in 2008 as it took too much time away from his ability to create books, and in 2012 he was honoured with an Inkpot Award at Comic-Con. He's married to his wife Janie, and they have 2 sons together, along with him having an estimated net worth of $5 million. Marc Silvestri. And I'm just gonna say, he has the best hair of any of the Image founders. Born in Florida in 1958, he became a fan of comics thanks to his cousin, and was influenced by the styles of Bernie Wrightson, John Buscema, and Frank Frazetta. His first illustrating work was on a few lesser known DC titles such as House of Mystery, Ghosts, and Weird War Tales. This was enough to get him some attention over at Marvel, where he worked on Masters of Kung Fu, King Conan, and a few other series until he broke into the X-Men scene in the late 80s. His sharp expressions and bold effects were significant signature part of his style that could be seen in some of the most important X-Men stories during Claremont's run. This also led to him doing a 20 or so issue stint on Wolverine, which elevated his platform further. However, he was replaced on X-Men in favour of Jim Lee, whose popularity was skyrocketing and overshadowed what Silvestri had built. Surprisingly though, the two were still friends, and it was only because they were talking with one another at an auction that Marc heard about Image when McFarlane introduced the idea to Jim. Enjoying the freedom that Image could offer, he joined forces with the other 6 founders and started out with Cyberforce, which he both wrote and did the art for. He started his own imprint, Top Cow, where he created another series called The Darkness, which I mostly remember for the video game adaptation, which ironically I was speaking to my friend Connor about the other day, and we concurred it is the game that just epitomizes that look that all early PS3 games had. Hopefully someone else knows what we're talking about. Top Cow became a legitimate brand within the comics industry, but its history is not without drama, as only a few years into Image, tensions were brewing between the founders. All of this was exacerbated in 1994, when Liefeld formed his own company called Maximum Press. On the surface, that may not seem so bad, but where Silvestri comes into this is after Liefeld proposed a merger between his Extreme Studios and Marc's Top Cow Productions, and when he knew that this didn't have a chance of happening, Liefeld then allegedly tried to recruit Top Cow artists and take the talent away from Silvestri, which led to him making the monumental decision in 1996 to leave Image altogether. However, the other founders could see that Liefeld was secretly trying to move his Image properties over to Maximum Press, an Image announcing that they had voted Rob out. But this isn't the Rob Liefeld section, so long story short, once the news broke out, Silvestri joined back up with Image. Top Cow continued to succeed, with Marc in the role of CEO. They published Witchblade, a book that's so 90s that it hurts, Wanted, Fathom, Rising Stars, and even got the Tomb Raider IP. Silvestri did the pencils for the Star Trek X-Men crossover in 1996. He did a few issues of the new X-Men in the early 2000s and launched a steady number of series under the Top Cow imprint. And in a turn that would have been blasphemous to the 1992 Image founders, Top Cow crossed over with Marvel in 2006 to produce a few titles, such as The Darkness Wolverine and Witchblade Punisher. Artists from Top Cow also worked on some of Marvel's books as part of this deal, which saw Silvestri doing the art for the one-shot that launched X-Men Messiah Complex. Top Cow is still up and running to this day, producing a healthy roster of titles, and was one of the first publishers to embrace digital comics in 2007. Through a partnership with IGN that they probably said would make you feel like a Top Cow, Silvestri took a step away from creating and became a bit more of a behind-the-scenes figure, although he oversaw and was executive producer on the Witchblade anime. Hey wait, no, hold up a minute, let me research this a bit more. I'll be back in a minute. And like you've heard a few times already, he teamed up with his fellow Image founders in 2009 for Image United. And to tell a lie, he recently came back in November 2022 to write and illustrate Batman and the Joker: The Deadly Duo. So although he may not have been one of the first picks when trying to get Image off the ground, Silvestri has more than solidified his place in comics history by giving it one of its biggest independent publishers. His career may not be as storied as some of the others in this video, but it's impossible to deny that his actions helped shape the direction the company went in, and is why he is currently CEO for Image Comics. He has an estimated net worth of $8 million and is married to his wife Bridget. Whilce Portacio, which, trust me, is a really hard name to say if you've got a bit of a lisp. Born in the Philippines in 1963, Portacio is the only founder of Image Comics that didn't decide to become a partner, and unfortunately is the one that people often struggle to remember. So he must be the doc of this band of 7. Despite this though, Whilce has one of my favourite styles from the early Image days. Having stated Kirby and Adams were his inspirations, he can balance light and shadow and crisp line work in a way that felt like a perfect bridge between what had come before and what would be popular throughout the 90s. But Portacio got his first opportunity in the comics industry as an inker for the likes of Frank Miller and Art Adams, having shown some of his portfolio to Marvel editor Carl Potts at the first San Diego Comic Con that Whilce attended. He then did the penciling work on titles such as The Punisher, X Factor, and Uncanny X-Men, and during this time he helped John Byrne create the fan favourite mutant Bishop. When the option of joining up with the other Image founders presented itself, he leapt at the opportunity, but due to the unfortunate circumstances of his sister falling extremely ill, this meant that his first work for the company wasn't published until 2 years after Image's debut in 1994, and was part of Jim Lee's Wildstorm imprint. Wetworks was a collaboration between Whilce and Brandon Choi, but Portacio left the title after issue 14. He then returned to Marvel to illustrate a few issues of the Heroes Reborn Iron Man series and did a handful of shorter projects back at Image. However, his streak of misfortune took him out of illustrating for 6 months in the year 2000, when he fell into a week-long diabetic coma that rendered him unable to walk, stand, or even draw. Most people would have given up at this point, but art was Whilce's his passion, and he returned to work on a handful of books, including Image United along with his fellow founders. Although his career isn't as prolific as some of the others in this video, he has still solidified himself as an integral component of Image Comics, and has withstood countless adversities to still amass a reported net worth of around $5 million. Additionally, he's responsible for introducing his high school friend Scott Williams into the comics industry, who would go on to do the regular inks for the likes of Jim Lee, Marc Silvestri, and is one of the most recognizable inkers in the medium. Rob Liefeld. Possibly the most controversial of the Image Comics founders, but if I say that, I risk him blocking me on Twitter. The youngest of the founders, having been born in 1967, Liefeld was raised in California and developed a love for comics in his childhood, where the likes of Perez, Miller, and Byrne inspired him to become an artist. His first comic work was in the pages of Megaton, as Rob was too intimidated at that time to send his art to Marvel or DC. His style that featured dynamic proportions, sharp lines, and massive hair was seen as a bit too jarring compared to the styles of the time, and he also had a really weird thing when it came to drawing feet, but editor Gary Carlson recognised its ability to clearly tell the story and provide direction. With a bit more confidence than he started out with, Liefeld travelled to a comic convention and showed samples of his work featuring his own characters, some of which would eventually make it into his Image titles. He was apprehensive, but by getting his work in front of Mark Gruenwald, he was offered an Avengers backup feature that didn't materialise. But it was the in that Rob needed to get more work, including a Spider-Man annual, the New Mutants, and over at DC did an issue of Secret Origins and the Hawk and Dove miniseries. He created the designs for fan favourite characters such as Cable and Deadpool, but all of that was small change in comparison to when he took on the art duties for X-Force. Over 4 million copies of the debut issue was sold, along with multiple variant covers, which to this day is still the second highest selling single issue of all time. This shot Liefeld into superstardom, something that he wanted to capitalise on by publishing a creator-owned title over at Malibu Comics called The Executioners. And no, I didn't stutter then, I just wanted to emphasise the X in the title. It should go without saying that Marvel didn't like this and threatened to fire Liefeld if he moved forward with the title. And where fellow founders such as McFarlane and Lee decided to leave Marvel because he felt undervalued, Liefeld wanted to start Image because he was concerned that the success of these bigger titles would end up leading to him being priced out. His first series at Image, Youngblood, was a debut book for the entire publisher, and the hype of the initiative was enough to drive pre-order sales to nearly 1 million units off the name recognition alone. But despite the sales numbers, there wasn't a lot about the book that people praised, which raised concerns for the longevity of Image overall, with people considering it unclear, poorly written, and quickly labelled it as a bit of a gimmick due to it being released in a flipbook format, which I can't imagine being fun to read. Those early issues, despite the sales figures, wasn't the success that Liefeld was hoping for, with the poor scripting being something that he pinned on his collaborator Hank Canals. Under his own imprint, Extreme Studios, he printed several of his own series, including Prophet, Bloodstrike, and Supreme, but in 1996, along with Jim Lee, he returned to Marvel for the Heroes Reborn relaunch, and did art on the Avengers and Captain America, where he created one of the most infamous images in all of comics. However, the fear Liefeld had prior to starting Image came true, as he was suddenly dropped from both titles due to sales not reaching what they'd expected. Things went from bad to worse that same year, as conflicts with fellow Image founder Marc Silvestri saw him temporarily break away from the company and taking his Top Cow imprint with him. Other people within the company were critical of Liefeld's decisions and the direction it was forcing Image to go in. In September of that same year, things came to a head when Liefeld announced he'd resigned from Image. The same time as the other Image founders announcing that Liefeld had been fired. This led to Rob teaming up with Malibu Comics to start another company called Awesome Comics, but after leaving he sued Image for breach of contract and wrongful termination, which I don't know how that would be possible if he had actually left on his own accord. Image then countersued, claiming Liefeld had used funds and staff from Image to set up his own company, Maximum Press. And I know there's been some repetition of parts of this story throughout this video, but this was something that I also touched on in the Marc Silvestri section. In the end, both cases were settled privately, but some of the founders stated that Liefeld had indeed paid back the money that he owed. But somehow he landed himself in deep water pretty much as soon as he left Image, as he tried to buy the rights to a Captain America-esque character, but wasn't happy with the price, so Liefeld instead created Agent America. This was later settled, but weird conditions were then placed on Liefeld's new character, but Liefeld did manage to get Alan Moore to write a run on the Supreme, so it wasn't all bad news during this era, and that series won an Eisner in 1997, and desperately needs a reprint in some form of collected edition, like come on, it's just money that's waiting on the table. Awesome Comics lasted until the year 2000 when it ceased operation due to their primary investors severing ties. This was the start of a decade of tribulations for Liefeld, where he bounced between a few different projects and he'd do the odd cover on a Marvel title or a limited series on X-Force, and he started a new self-funded publishing house called Arcade Comics, but he didn't seem to maintain much momentum. He did connect with Robert Kirkman during this time, who he did the art for on a Killraven series, but his heart was still with his Youngblood team. He launched 2 new spin-off titles for the series whilst pushing Arcade Comics, one of which was written by Mark Millar, but only 1 issue was ever published. It wasn't until 2007, the 15th anniversary of Image Comics, that things started to look positive again, as both Liefeld and Youngblood returned to Image, and the 7 founders were reunited at a panel at San Diego Comic-Con that same year. And although Youngblood only ran for 9 issues, it was the start of the wheels turning once again for Rob. In the 2010s, he went back to his most famous creation, Deadpool, to do the art on a Deadpool course spin-off, and went back to DC for the New 52 relaunch of Hawk and Dove, along with a few other titles, but left DC abruptly when he had issues with editor Brian Smith, which categorised the theme of this decade for Liefeld: Twitter beefs. This wasn't even his last Twitter feud with DC Comics, as he'd speak out in 2019 following the fallout of Batman Damned issue 1, which it's probably just best that you don't Google, where he claimed that the company was sinking and that they should fire everyone in upper management. But the backlash to these comments was so severe that Liefeld took a break from Twitter. Don't worry though, he also caused controversy on the Marvel side when he insulted pretty much every creator who'd ever worked on Deadpool by calling them D-list. And he must have just forgotten that he'd worked on Deadpool. The backlash was so severe that Liefeld later apologized for this comment, and it had all blown over shortly after so that he could still make a cameo in the 2016 Deadpool movie. So it's not completely off base to call him a controversial figure, but regardless, Liefeld has solidified himself as an important one within the comics industry, and his brash attitude is probably one of the key reasons why we even have Image Comics in the first place. He may not always stick the landing, but he dares to take that leap anytime there's an opportunity. He's married to actress Joy Creel, and they have 3 kids together, and the dodgy net worth estimate puts Liefeld anywhere between $2 million and above $5 million, which is possibly the vaguest one so far. So that is the story of the 7 Image Comics founders. Yeah, there's probably been details here and there that I've left out along the way, but it's because it's been over 30 years since they created history, and in many ways are still doing so to this day. They gave us a publisher that brought independent comics into the mainstream, and that's not meant to be a disrespect to the likes of Dark Horse, 2000 AD, or any of the other companies that existed then, but it speaks more to the strength and will of these 7 pioneers and how they were able to go against the grain, seize the reins of becoming businessmen and not just settle for the role of being a creator, and weather the storm of a volatile comics landscape and even conflicts with one another to ensure that Image Comics can still exist today. It wasn't smooth sailing and the odds were stacked against them, but if they had failed and called it quits, every creator out there would know that stepping outside of the umbrella of the big 2 publishers would be a death sentence for the career. So although it is fun seeing who went where, and hopefully I've done a good job of conveying that, it's more important to remember what these 7 founders represented, and regardless of whether you like them all or not, they all had a part to play in this story. So that's the video. It's taken me a while to make this one. I wanted to try and do something that's more documentary style. It is something that I do want to do a bit more of on this channel, and hopefully not take as long to do them. So until next time, just make sure you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof. See you in the next video.